They were just boys. Three young brothers, laughing together in the warm Alabama sun, their small hands sticky with cotton candy from the county fair. But in a blink, everything changed, because what happened to them was almost too strange to believe. Imagine a quiet town in 1980, fields stretching for miles, the hum of cicadas in the hot summer air, and neighbors who all claimed to know one another. This was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked, and the idea of danger seemed laughable. And yet, that very sense of safety would soon be shattered. The three brothers, Elliot 12, Mason 10, and little Noah just 7, were inseparable. Their mother often said they were like a single heart beating in 3 bodies. They played in the woods behind their home, chased fireflies at dusk, and raced their bikes down the dusty roads of their sleepy neighborhood. To the adult, it was a picture-perfect childhood. But sometimes, even the most idyllic scenes hide the darkest shadows. It was a Thursday afternoon when the oddness began. The boys had left for a short bike ride, promising their mother they'd be back before sunset. But hours passed, and then nothing. No footprints in the dusty lane. No signs of struggle. Just silence. The town, initially dismissive. After all, kids often wandered off, slowly realized something was very wrong. Days turned into a week, and still, the three brothers had vanished without a trace. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Witnesses reported seeing a strange figure in the area around the time the boys disappeared. Some described a man in a dark coat, though no one could quite say if he was a local. Others swore they saw a van idling near the edge of the woods. But by the time the police arrived, it was gone, almost as if it had never existed. And this, dear viewers, is where the absurdity begins. Because in Alabama, in a town where nothing unusual ever happened, 3 boys vanished. And nobody, not the neighbors, not the authorities, had any clue why. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. This story, like so many of our episodes, will take you on a journey you'll never forget, and you'll want to see every twist until the very end. The boys weren't just siblings. They were a unit, each one complementing the other in ways only brothers can. Elliot, the eldest at 12, had a protective streak that was almost fierce. He'd often carry Mason on his back when they played in the creek, or share his lunch when Noah was too shy to ask for food at school. Mason, 10, was clever, always asking questions that adults pretended not to notice, as if he was searching for something beyond the small world around him. And little Noah, 7 years old, endlessly curious, his laughter echoing like wind chimes through the narrow streets of their neighborhood. Their home was modest but warm. Their mother, a woman known for her kindness and quiet strength, raised the boys on her own after her father had passed away several years prior. She kept a small garden in the backyard, taught them to read under the shade of the magnolia tree, and filled their lives with bedtime stories of adventure and bravery. The townsfolk often said that if anyone could raise 3 boys to be kind, curious, and strong, it would be her. But even the safest places have cracks. Neighbors would later recall strange occurrences, small, easily dismissed incidents that, in hindsight, felt like warnings. A fleeting shadow on the edge of the woods. A strange van seen parked near the schoolyard. Odd phone calls late at night, the voice on the other end so distorted it was impossible to recognize. At the time, it was easy to chalk it up to imagination. After all, the South in 1980 was full of stories and superstitions. People saw things in the dark woods all the time, and yet sometimes the absurd hides the sinister. The boys' disappearance didn't just happen. It felt like a puzzle piece had fallen out of place in a picture that once seemed complete. On that fateful Thursday, neighbors remember hearing Elliot calling for his brothers as the sun began to set, a distant laughter, quickly fading into an uneasy silence. When their mother stepped outside, calling their names, the only response was a rustling of the wind through the pine trees. No bikes, no shoes, no sound at all except the unsettling quiet that seemed to swallow the street whole. By the end of that first night, the reality was undeniable. 3 boys were missing, and no one had the faintest clue where they could have gone or why. The town, usually unshakable in its rhythm, became a place of whispers and suspicion. Who could have taken them? And more importantly, who would, Before we move into part 2, where the investigation begins and the first cracks in the town's peaceful facade start to show, take a moment and hit the like button. It helps us bring more stories like this to life. And trust me, you'll want to stay until the very last revelation. The sun rose the next morning over the quiet streets of the small Alabama town. But for the first time in its history, the dawn brought no relief, only a sense of dread. 3 young boys were gone, vanished as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. And as their mother screamed their names into the still morning air, neighbors began to gather, drawn by the panic that now hung heavy over the town like a dark cloud. By mid-morning, a search party had formed. Men and women, young and old, grabbed flashlights, lanterns, even rakes and pitchforks, and headed into the woods, fields, and back roads. Dogs barked nervously, sniffing at the tall grass as if they sensed the unnatural absence in the air. But no trace of the boys could be found. Their bikes were gone, their shoes left behind. Nothing in their rooms suggested they had planned to leave. The local sheriff, a grizzled man with decades of experience, initially tried to maintain calm. "Kids wander off sometimes," he told the gathering crowd. "They'll come back." But even he couldn't ignore the unease creeping into his chest. This wasn't a typical disappearance. There were no notes, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain where 3 boys could vanish simultaneously in a town this small. As the search continued into the afternoon, strange reports began to surface. A neighbor claimed she had seen a man in a dark coat near the edge of the woods the previous evening, standing so still it seemed almost unnatural. Others said they heard muffled laughter, or maybe it was crying, just as the sun dipped behind the horizon. A small group of boys from the neighborhood swore they saw a van parked near the creek, its engine running, but the license plate was smeared with dirt. And when the sheriff sent deputies to investigate, the van had disappeared without a trace. The townsfolk began to speculate, their imaginations fueled by fear and uncertainty. Some whispered about old family feuds, long-forgotten grudges simmering beneath the surface. Others suggested something more sinister. Kidnappers, perhaps, taking advantage of the town's complacency. But for every theory, there was another voice insisting it was impossible, that evil like this didn't touch their peaceful community. Meanwhile, the boys' mother refused to leave her home. She walked the streets, calling their names, retracing their steps, praying desperately. Friends tried to convince her to rest, to eat, to take care of herself, but she couldn't. Every minute without them felt like an eternity, each one a dagger twisting in her heart. By the 3rd day, the sheriff had called in assistance from the state police. Dogs trained in tracking were brought in, helicopters hovered over the dense woods, and every nearby county was alerted. Search teams fanned out in systematic patterns, combing every inch of the surrounding area. Still, nothing. No footprints, no clothing, no indication of where the boys had gone. And then came the first real clue. It was small, almost insignificant. A piece of red fabric snagged on a branch near the creek where the boys often played. Investigators carefully bagged it, noting that it appeared to be part of one of the boys' shirts. But there was no other evidence nearby. No footprints leading toward it. No signs that anyone had struggled there. Just a fabric, hanging in the wind like a silent witness to something unthinkable. This discovery, instead of offering hope, only deepened the fear. The town began to change overnight. Parents held their children closer. Doors that had been left unlocked for decades were now bolted tight. And whispers of the woods became warnings rather than stories. Local kids were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves seemed like a threat. As days turned into weeks, the case became a national story. Reporters flocked to the small town, shining lights into the darkness and demanding answers. Photographs of the missing boys were plastered on milk cartons, newspapers, and billboards. Offers of rewards appeared. First hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of dollars, for any information leading to their safe return. But despite the growing attention, the boys remained missing. Investigators interviewed everyone. Teachers, neighbors, family friends, anyone who might have had contact with the boys before they vanished. Patterns emerged, small and fragile. Some witnesses recalled a stranger asking unusual questions about the boys in the days leading up to their disappearance. Others mentioned hearing the boys talk about a man they didn't know, someone who had shown up near the creek where they played. But each lead ended in frustration. Nothing concrete, nothing that pointed clearly to what had happened. And yet, amid the frustration, the investigators noticed something odd about the way the town itself was reacting. People were nervous, even suspicious of one another. Long-held grudges that had been buried began to resurface. Neighbors accused neighbors of hiding information. Families who had once shared friendly meals now avoided one another, fearful that anyone, might have had a role in the disappearance. One of the investigators later described it as a creeping paranoia, a quiet unease that hung over the town like a fog. And the more they looked, the more they realized that the truth might not just be outside the town, but within it. By the fourth week, the case had taken on an almost mythical quality. People began reporting sightings of the boys in other towns, claims that were quickly debunked, but which added to the sense of mystery. And still, the fabric found at the creek remained the only tangible clue. Then, one night, the sheriff received a call that changed everything. A man, living on the outskirts of town, reported hearing voices coming from his barn. He wasn't sure if it was children or animals. But when the deputies arrived, they found nothing, only a strange set of tracks leading into the nearby woods, disappearing into the darkness. Tracks that didn't match any known animal. Tracks that would later become a critical piece of evidence in unraveling the mystery. By now, the town was holding its collective breath. Every knock at the door, every late-night sound, every passing vehicle was met with fear and suspicion. And for the families, each passing day was an agony they could not describe, a constant, gnawing uncertainty that made even the simplest acts of daily life unbearable. The case had begun to consume not just the sheriff and the state police, but the town itself. Everyone felt implicated in some way, as if the disappearance had drawn an invisible line through the community, dividing it between those who knew and those who didn't. And all the while, the boys remained missing. If you're still with us, make sure to comment below and let us know what you think happened to them. Every story has theories, and some of the best ones come from viewers like you, but the first twist in this story was still waiting. A revelation so shocking, it would change everything the town thought it knew about safety, family, and trust. And when that twist comes, you'll see why even the most mundane moments in life can hide something unimaginable. Weeks had passed since the disappearance, but the sense of unease in the town only grew. The sheriff, state investigators, and volunteers scoured the woods, dug through the fields, and even questioned travelers passing through the area. Yet every lead seemed to collapse under the weight of impossibility. Then came the call that would change everything. A local farmer, known for his quiet life on the outskirts of town, reported something chilling. In the dead of night, he had heard faint cries coming from his property. His barn, old, weathered, and tucked behind tall pines, stood silent and empty when the deputies arrived. But outside, they found something strange, a set of footprints, small but deliberate, leading from the barn into the nearby woods. They were not animal tracks. They were children's. The sheriff examined them closely. Something about the spacing, the rhythm of the steps, suggested the children hadn't been walking freely. They had been guided, and the tracks ended abruptly, swallowed by the dense underbrush. It was as if the forest itself had refused to let the boys continue. Over the next few days, the investigators uncovered more hints of this inexplicable presence. Oddly placed items in the woods, a discarded shoe, a small toy car, a torn page from a notebook, suggested that the boys had been nearby, but they offered no clue as to their destination. The pieces were there, scattered and tantalizing, yet the full picture remained hidden. And then came the first real shock. The sheriff received an anonymous letter, postmarked from a nearby town. Inside, the words were written with precise, almost clinical handwriting. The boys are safe, but they are not where you think. Look close at home. No name, no address, just those 6 words. At first, the letter was dismissed as a cruel prank. But when the investigators compared the handwriting to local records, nothing matched. And the phrasing so specific, so unnervingly calm, suggested knowledge far beyond what anyone could have gleaned from rumors. The town's anxiety skyrocketed. Could the boys really be hidden somewhere in plain sight? Neighbors began looking at one another differently. Friends became suspicious. Parents whispered behind closed doors. And the mother of the boys, already fraying under the stress of uncertainty, started noticing things she had never seen before. A neighbor, usually kind and quiet, asking unusual questions about her children. A stranger occasionally lingering near the edges of her yard, vanishing when noticed. Every sound at night made her heart race. Every shadow felt threatening. The investigation also revealed an unsettling detail. The timing of the disappearance wasn't random. The boys had vanished at the exact hour when most of the town's adults were either at work or distracted by daily routines. It was as if someone had studied their habits, waiting for the perfect moment. Detectives began to entertain a possibility that had previously seemed too dark to consider, that the abduction was not a random act of evil, but deliberate, calculated plan. Someone had observed the boys, learned their routines, and acted with precision, and yet every attempt to trace the anonymous letter, every inquiry into strangers in town, led to dead ends. The trail grew colder with each passing day, but beneath the frustration, there were subtle patterns beginning to emerge, patterns that only someone looking with both logic and instinct could notice. One of the investigators, a young detective with a sharp mind and a knack for connecting the seemingly unrelated, began noticing something peculiar about the way the townspeople described the boys' routines. Several people mentioned the boys talking about secret meetings in the woods, as if they had their own hidden world. A favorite hiding spot beneath a large oak tree had been mentioned repeatedly by children in the neighborhood. Though the adults dismissed it as playful imagination, the detective wondered, what if the boys' innocence had been exploited? What if someone had manipulated their games, their curiosity, and their trust, drawing them into something they didn't understand? Then came another lead, one that would make even the most seasoned investigators shiver. A local boy reported seeing the brothers near an abandoned shack on the outskirts of town, days after their disappearance. He insisted he saw them laughing, carefree, as if nothing had happened. But the description of the man with them, their apparent guardian, matched the vague sightings reported near the creek in the first week. At that moment, it became clear the boys were not entirely missing. Someone had them, and this someone was close enough to the town to remain unnoticed, yet calculating enough to evade every search, every inquiry, every desperate attempt at discovery. The revelation sent a ripple through the community. Fear turned to anger. Anger turned to suspicion. And suspicion, well, suspicion had a way of corrupting even the most tight-knit communities. People began accusing friends, neighbors, even distant relatives. The town's cohesion, the very thing that had defined its identity, was beginning to crumble under the weight of paranoia and dread. Amid the chaos, the detective continued to study the scattered clues, the footprints, the abandoned items, the cryptic letter, and began to see an unsettling pattern. It was as if the person responsible was leaving breadcrumbs, taunting the investigators with their cleverness. Each new piece of evidence was carefully placed, just enough to suggest a lead, but never enough to deliver the full truth. By the end of the second month, the case had grown into a spectacle. State and federal agencies were involved. Reporters camped outside the sheriff's office, and tips poured in from across the country. Yet the boys remained elusive, their fate still a haunting question mark over the town. And just when the community began to despair, the first twist emerged, one that no one had predicted. The investigation uncovered that one of the closest friends of the boy's mother, someone the family had trusted implicitly, had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Small things, arriving unannounced, asking unusual questions about the boys' schedules, lingering too long when visiting. At first, these were dismissed as signs of concern, but in hindsight, they were markers of something far more calculated. Suddenly, the idea that the abduction had been random seemed almost impossible. Someone the family trusted might have known far more than they had admitted. And if that were true, then the community's nightmare was only just beginning. The tension was suffocating. Every call, every doorbell, every rustling of leaves became a potential sign. The town could no longer tell friend from foe. And yet, amid the fear, one truth became painfully clear. The boy's disappearance was not a mystery or chance. It was a puzzle designed with intention, precision, and a chilling understanding of human behavior. If you're still watching, leave a comment with your theories about the first twist. Sometimes the viewers see clues the investigators missed. And hit that subscribe button, because the next session will reveal even darker secrets, impossible choices, and the shocking turns that would eventually lead to the arrest. By the third month, the search for the three young brothers had transformed from a local emergency into a full-blown investigation that gripped the entire state. Alabama's law enforcement agencies were now united, combing every mile of forest, field, and road. Airplanes circled overhead, searchlights cutting swaths through the night, while volunteers trudged through mud and underbrush, scanning for the faintest trace of the boys. And yet, despite the overwhelming effort, the trail remained frustratingly cold. It was as though the boys had been swallowed by the earth itself, leaving nothing but echoes of laughter and whispers of fear in their wake. The townspeople were unraveling. Parents became hypervigilant, locking doors and windows for the first time in decades. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised, and neighbors whispered suspicions behind drawn curtains. Every unfamiliar face, every passing vehicle, became a potential threat. And amid it all, the boy's mother wandered to the streets, a hollow shell herself, desperately retracing steps that no longer existed. Then, something unusual happened, something that no one could have predicted. Investigators received an anonymous tip delivered in the dead of night, urging them to investigate a property long abandoned on the edge of town. The sender didn't provide a name, only a cryptic message. Look where no one wants to go. The truth sleeps there. It was strange, unnerving, almost absurd. The property had been abandoned for years. No one visited it. Even the bravest locals avoided it after dusk, claiming it was haunted or worse. But desperate for any lead, the investigators decided to act. What they found was unsettling. The property was a dilapidated farmhouse with peeling paint, broken windows, and a sagging porch. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and dust coated the floor like a silent witness to decades of neglect. But amidst the ruin, investigators found evidence that someone had been there recently. Footprints in the dirt, remnants of food, and a small blanket tucked beneath the stairs. And then came the first truly chilling discovery. A collection of drawings, hand-drawn sketches, crude but unmistakable, depicting the boys in various locations around the town. Some drawings were dated weeks before their disappearance. Others seemed to represent places no one had ever seen. Strange landscapes that were almost dreamlike in their construction. Whoever had left these drawings was obsessive, meticulous, and disturbingly close to the boys' daily lives. At this point, investigators began to suspect that the person responsible had been planning this for months. It was no random act. It was methodical, precise, and terrifyingly deliberate. The first twist began to emerge when interviews with townspeople revealed something impossible. A series of sightings of a man who had lived on the outskirts of town for decades, a man who had rarely interacted with anyone, but who seemed to know the boys' routines in uncanny detail. His presence had been noted repeatedly, often in passing, but no one had connected the dots. Until now, this man, described as tall and gaunt, always wearing a long coat and a hat that shadowed his face, became the focal point of the investigation. Witnesses recalled seeing him near the creek where the boys played, near the abandoned barn, and even at the edge of the forest during the search parties. And here's the part that made investigators' stomachs turn. He had no alibi for the day the boys disappeared. Every clue now pointed toward him, yet he remained elusive. Background checks revealed nothing. No prior arrests, no known family, no connection to the town's residents. It was as if he had existed in parallel, watching silently, waiting for the perfect moment. And then the second shock came, something that would turn the case on its head. A small, almost insignificant detail uncovered in one of the old sketches of the farmhouse, a symbol, repeated in several drawings, that no one initially recognized. It was an abstract shape, like a keyhole twisted into a spiral. At first, the investigators dismissed it, but forensic analysis suggested it wasn't random. It was a code, a sign meant only for someone who knew its meaning. This revelation sparked a theory that would divide the investigative team. Some believed it was a calling card, left by the abductor as a form of twisted communication. Others fear it indicated that the boys were being held somewhere far from town, in a place that only the perpetrator knew. Meanwhile, the townspeople's paranoia intensified. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the abductor was not one man, but a pair, someone working in tandem, careful and calculating. Others whispered darker theories of a hidden cult or underground network preying on children. Every explanation seemed more absurd than the last. Yet the fear felt real enough to change the rhythm of life in the town forever. Amid this chaos, the detective who had been following subtle patterns noticed a chilling connection. The sketches, the anonymous tips, even the strange footprints in the woods, all of it pointed to someone familiar with the town's routines, someone with intimate knowledge of its geography and its residents. The idea that the abductor was an outsider seemed increasingly unlikely, and that's when the first twist truly landed. During a late-night stakeout near the edge of the woods, one of the detectives noticed movement, a figure slipping through the shadows with deliberate, careful steps. They followed, but the figure vanished into the darkness. When they later returned to the spot, they found a small, carved wooden figure, one that bore an eerie resemblance to one of the boys. It was the first piece of evidence that suggested the boys were alive, that someone was keeping them nearby, and that the abductor was not just hiding them, but toying with the investigators. The community, once unified in grief and fear, began to fracture. Trust eroded. Neighbors avoided each other. Every friendly gesture was met with suspicion. And the boy's mother, holding on to a fragile hope, began to realize that the person responsible might be someone she knew, someone she had trusted without question. The stage was set for the next revelation, a twist that would shake the town to its core and bring the investigation closer to uncovering the truth. And as the search continued, one fact became terrifyingly clear. Nothing about this case was ordinary. Every clue, every lead, every strange occurrence was part of a larger, incomprehensible puzzle. If you're still watching, take a moment and imagine the tension in that town, the fear, the paranoia, the desperate hope. And remember, sometimes the people who seem closest to the problem are the ones who hold the answer. The nights in the small Alabama town had grown heavy with fear. Parents slept lightly. Children were never left alone. And every creak of floorboards, every whisper whined to the trees, became a signal to brace for the worst. The disappearance of Elliot, Mason, and Noah was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a living nightmare, a shadow that hung over every home, every street, and every conversation. By the fourth month of the search, the investigation had entered uncharted territory. The detective team had cataloged every tip, mapped every sighting, and reconstructed every clue, yet the boys remained unseen. And then came a breakthrough that seemed almost too surreal to believe. It began with the sketches discovered in the abandoned farmhouse. A painstaking review revealed that the strange spiral keyhole symbol appeared not just randomly. It corresponded to locations the boys had frequented before their disappearance. Even more unsettling, the investigator noticed subtle markings in the sketches indicating paths through the woods, lines that seemed to direct someone familiar with the terrain. The implication was impossible to ignore. Someone had been observing the boys for months, tracking their routines, and guiding them in ways that no one could have predicted. This wasn't just an abduction. It was a meticulous, orchestrated operation. Then, a local man came forward with an account that would send shockwaves through the town. He claimed to have seen a man moving deliberately between the woods and an old, unused shed near the outskirts of the town. What made this sighting chilling was not just the man's presence, but the fact that the witness recognized him. It was someone who had lived in the town for years, someone everyone trusted implicitly. The revelation hit the community like a thunderclap, a neighbor, a friend, someone who had been part of their daily lives. And worse, no one had suspected. No one had noticed. Investigators soon focused on this individual, quietly gathering evidence. Phone records, employment history, and interactions with the family were scrutinized. Small details, previously overlooked, began to form a picture that was both horrifying and unbelievable. One particularly chilling discovery came from an interview with the boy's mother's closest friend. She had noticed peculiar behavior. Late-night walks near the woods, an unusual curiosity about the boys' schedules, and an obsessive interest in where they played. At the time, She had dismissed it as harmless eccentricity. Now, in retrospect, it painted a far darker reality. The tension in the town was palpable. People began locking doors, suspending trust, and questioning every relationship. Even the most mundane interactions, passing a neighbor on the street, greeting a friend, were now shadowed by suspicion. The disappearance had infected the town's social fabric, leaving fear and mistrust in its wake. Then came the discovery that would become the first major twist. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the abandoned farmhouse was a small, crudely constructed room. It was barely more than a crawl space, but inside were remnants that suggested someone had been keeping children there. Small blankets, a worn teddy bear, a notebook filled with childish scribbles. And while there was no immediate sign of the boys, the space's very existence confirmed what the investigators had long feared. The abductor was operating in plain sight, using spaces no one thought to check, hiding evidence in the most mundane places. But the shock didn't end there. Analysis of sketches revealed more than just paths. It showed a timeline. The abductor had meticulously charted days, weeks, and even months in advance. It was a level of planning that defied comprehension, a cruel intelligence orchestrating the boys' disappearance with precision. At this point, the first plot twist fully emerged. The townspeople realized the person responsible was not an outsider, not some wandering criminal. It was someone embedded in their community, someone they had seen, trusted, and interacted with every day. The betrayal was almost unbearable. Fear turned to anger, and anger began to ripple outward in waves of suspicion and paranoia. The investigation intensified. Surveillance was placed on anyone connected to the suspect. Tips poured in from neighbors, many motivated by fear, others by guilt. And amid it all, investigators began to piece together a theory so disturbing that even seasoned detectives struggled to accept it. The evidence suggested that the suspect had been manipulating the boys' routines, grooming them in ways subtle enough to evade notice but precise enough to guide them. The sketches, the footprints, the hidden spaces, all pointed to a methodical, calculated predator who understood the town's rhythms better than anyone. And yet, despite this mounting evidence, the boys were still missing. The investigation had uncovered patterns, locations, and even timelines, but the final piece, the location of the children, remained elusive. The town, meanwhile, had fractured almost beyond repair. Friends avoided friends. Families mistrusted neighbors. And everywhere, the whisper persisted. If someone so close could betray a family, who could be trusted at all? Then, as if mocking the investigator's frustration, a new lead emerged, a small, innocuous detail in the form of a diary entry from one of the boys' friends. The entry mentioned seeing the boys following a tall man in a dark coat toward a location they called the hidden place. The wording was childish, the meaning unclear, but investigators immediately recognized it as a significant clue. The realization hit hard. The boys were being kept somewhere the investigators had yet to search. And the phrase hidden place suggested the suspect's cunning, choosing a location so familiar, so seemingly ordinary, that no one would think to check. By now, the story had taken on almost mythic proportions. It was no longer just a case. It was a puzzle, a psychological labyrinth designed to test the limits of the investigators, the patience of community, and the endurance of the boys' family. And as the investigation pressed forward, one fact remained undeniable. The abductor was not only smart, meticulous, and cruel, but terrifyingly close. Before we move to Part 4, where the investigation reaches its breaking point and the first major arrest shocks the community, take a moment to reflect on the tension in this town. Imagine living in a place where the person you trust most could be orchestrating the unthinkable. That is exactly the nightmare the residents of this Alabama town endured, month after month, day after day. It was a quiet morning in the small Alabama town when the call came through, one that would send shockwaves through every household, every street, and every family. The sheriff's office had finally identified a suspect, someone no one had ever imagined could be capable of such cruelty. The news spread quickly, whispers turning into gasps, and gasps into a collective disbelief that gripped the community like ice. The man, a neighbor known for his quiet demeanor and unassuming presence, had been under surveillance for weeks. Investigators had pieced together enough evidence to obtain a search warrant, And as deputies approached his modest home on the outskirts of town, the tension was almost unbearable. Families watched from behind curtains, children clinging to parents, everyone wondering if, after months of torment and speculation, justice would finally reveal itself. When the deputies entered the home, the scene was both chilling and surreal. Hidden within the back of the house was a small, carefully concealed room. Inside, the boys, Elliot, Mason, and Noah, were found alive. They were frightened, yes, and clearly traumatized, but unharmed. Their reunion with their mother was immediate, raw, and heart-wrenching, the kind of moment that defies description. Tears, trembling, and whispered promises filled the room as the family embraced, years of fear compressed into a single, overwhelming instant. The man, arrested without resistance, was taken into custody. His calm demeanor only intensified the town's horror. Here was a person who had been living among them, attending the same grocery stores, walking the same streets, and yet orchestrating a disappearance that had confounded experts for months. The betrayal cut deep. As the investigation continued, more unsettling details emerged. The suspect had not acted on impulse. Every step, every hidden space, every piece of evidence left behind had been meticulously planned. And the cryptic sketches? They were revealed to be part of a disturbing psychological game, a way to control and manipulate the boys while taunting the investigators. The town was left reeling. People struggled to reconcile the idea that someone they knew, someone familiar, could commit such a crime. Friendships were tested. Families examined their own interactions. And for many, the sense of security that had defined the town for generations had been shattered forever. Yet amid the fear and anger, there was relief. The boys were home. Justice, finally, had begun its course. The arrests, the evidence, and the painstaking investigation proved that even the most carefully concealed crimes could be uncovered with persistence, intelligence, and courage. In the weeks that followed, the community slowly began to heal. The boys attended counseling. Their mother leaned on friends and relatives, and the town worked to restore a sense of normalcy. But scars remained, reminders that evil could hide in plain sight, and that vigilance was never a luxury. The case also left lessons that extended beyond the town. Investigators reflected on the importance of following every lead, no matter how absurd it seemed, and of listening to instinct as well as evidence. They realized that understanding human behavior, patterns, routines, and subtle manipulations was often the key to solving the most baffling mysteries. For the families, the ordeal forged a bond that was unbreakable. The boys, despite their trauma, learned the resilience of the human spirit, and their story became a cautionary tale about trust, vigilance, and the shadows that can exist even in the most seemingly idyllic communities. As viewers, it's impossible not to feel the tension, the fear, and the eventual relief that comes with such a resolution. And if you're watching this, take a moment to reflect. Sometimes, evil lurks where we least expect it, but courage, persistence, and compassion can bring even the darkest secrets to light. Before we continue into Session 2, where we explore the emotional aftermath, the prison years, and the lessons the town and the world would carry forward, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story has layers, and your insights might uncover clues or perspectives others missed. The months after the rescue were a time of fragile recovery. Elliot, Mason, and Noah returned to their home, but nothing was quite the same. Their mother, though overjoyed, faced the daunting task of helping her sons navigate a world that had suddenly grown terrifyingly complex. Each smile came slowly, each laughed cautiously, as the boys worked to process the months of fear and uncertainty they had endured. Therapists were brought in, specializing in trauma and childhood recovery. The boys learned to speak again about their experiences, first in whispers, then in hesitant sentences, and finally in the raw honesty of children reclaiming their lives. Their mother, too, underwent counseling, facing the guilt and anguish she had carried for months, wondering if she had missed signs, failed in some unseen way, or could have prevented their abduction. The town, still reeling from the betrayal, began a slow, uneven process of healing. People returned to their routines, reopened their homes, and tried to restore the trust that had been so cruelly fractured. Community meetings were held, public discussions about safety and vigilance became commonplace, and the sheriff worked tirelessly to rebuild confidence in law enforcement. Yet the shadow of the events lingered. Parents remained cautious, children wary, and even the most familiar streets seemed tinged with unease. The case had left an indelible mark, a reminder that even the most idyllic communities were not immune to the darkest impulses of human nature. Meanwhile, the legal process unfolded. The man responsible for the boy's disappearance faced trial. His actions, calculated, manipulative, and meticulously planned, shocked jurors and townspeople alike. Evidence, painstakingly gathered over months, painted a clear picture of a predator who had hidden in plain sight. The courtroom was tense, the testimony emotionally charged, as the boy's mother recounted the months of fear and uncertainty. When the verdict was finally delivered, there was a collective exhale. Guilty. The man was sentenced to decades in prison, ensuring that the town would not have to live in fear of his return. Justice, though delayed, had been served. In the aftermath, the town began to reflect on what had been lost and what had been gained. The bonds of community, once strained, were slowly reforged. Families grew closer, neighbors more vigilant, and the lessons of trust and awareness were seared into the collective consciousness. The story of the three brothers became a cautionary tale, a reminder that vigilance, courage, and community can withstand even the most chilling of betrayals. The boys themselves, over time, found moments of joy again. Elliot returned to school with a newfound resilience. Mason discovered a love of drawing, perhaps inspired by the sketches that had once been used against him. And Noah's laughter returned, small and hesitant at first, like the first gentle ripple of a pond disturbed and slowly settling. For the families who helped in the search, for the investigators who had never given up, and for the townspeople who had endured months of fear, the case left a lasting impact. It was a testament to perseverance, to the power of community, and to the strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable darkness. As we close this chapter, take a moment to reflect with us. This story, though fictionalized, captures the essence of what so many families have faced in real cold cases: the uncertainty, the fear, the heartbreak, and ultimately, the resilience that allows life to continue. It is a story of hope, of courage, and of the undeniable truth that even in the darkest times, light can return. If you've been following this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into cases that captivate, horrify, and inspire. And in the comments, tell us what moment struck you the most. Was it the town's paranoia, the meticulous planning of the abductor, or the raw emotion of the rescue? Every perspective adds to the conversation and keeps these stories alive. Because in the end, it's not just about solving a case. It's about remembering the lives touched, the lessons learned, and the courage it takes to face the unimaginable.